Dr. Al is also the spiritual coordinator of the Anshe Shtasov Slipa Congregation. And in that context, he has brought some very innovative ideas to a former Landsmannschaften congregation. He is the author of Imposing Their Will, an organizational history of Toronto Jews from 1933 to 1948. And some of the work that he did for his doctoral thesis is in that book, and you're hearing some of that in his presentation last week and this week. And that book won the Joseph Brant Award of the Ontario Historical Society, not the Ontario Jewish Book Award, the Ontario Historical Society. You can see his topic up here, Jewish Continuity to 1948. It's my pleasure to welcome my friend, my teacher, and my colleague, Dr. Jack Lipinsky.
Harry's doing too. All right, so I'm really glad. First of all, I have to thank the Pollock family and Rabbi Freeman Cole, who I'm fortunate to have as a friend, colleague, and confidant, for his very generous introduction. All right, good. I want to talk to you about Jewish continuity, but not in the usual way that you always hear about it. We're going to ask ourselves the question in a sociological way and get to Rav Baruch's question towards the end of today and in our next talk, because we're still at the moment last week I put up the sort of idea that Baker Street is like a thermometer of acceptance. When this period began, we were down near King Street and Queen Street. We've now advanced roughly to Forest Hill and Lawrence. And towards the end of today, we're going to start saying, what's the road, both geographically and symbolically, between Forest Hill, Lawrence, Thornhill, and the wilds of Vaughan. So as I mentioned last week, just briefly to recap in 1 minute, I mentioned the idea that the journeys of the Bible, the two foundational journeys of the Bible being Abraham's migration from Ur and, of course, the foundational exodus from Egypt, signify not only geographical migration, but fundamental sociological and religious changes. And I also postulated that we see that also in our migrations through Toronto. What we're talking about today are what are the sociological conditions that explain Jewish continuity, because we're all part of it. So this is today. We're looking at the UJA's incredibly successful campaign of 2013. Very complicated. And I'm not going to take you through it. I want to leave you with a thought that this is obviously a sophisticated community. It's able to raise a large amount of money. It's able to agree on how to allocate those funds throughout the community. And the question we're going to engage in today is, how did it get to be that way? Because I'm going to suggest to you that by studying organizational history, we learn a great deal about ourselves. So,
I need you to speak in different ways.
Yes, my friend.
Heard more.
So, make me a suggestion.
Try this.
Try this.
And as they say in radio, kiss the mic.
Got it. So, the first question I'm asking you, I want to move my mic slightly sideways like this so I can read this here. The first thing I'm saying to you is something very important that my teacher Raymond Breton taught. And I want you to think about it really, really carefully. Read that for a moment. Let me put that into non-sociology terms. When we go up and down Bathurst Street, there are so many places that serve our ethnicity. How does that work for us? It works for us very well. It's easy to be a Jew in a large Jewish community. We almost take that for granted. But as we saw last week, the community that grew up 100 years ago was very fragmented, not only by their definition of what it meant to be a Jew, but by their understanding of ethnicity. Some felt being a Jew was a religious thing. Some felt it was also an ethnic thing when they came from Galicia or Romania or Poland or Russia. Others felt being Jewish was a social thing. Others felt it was an act of being associated with peoplehood. Others were Zionists. But yet what we see in Breton's statement, which by the way applies to every ethnic group, is that the more ways an ethnic group can find itself to be served, the better it will do. So let's see how that plays out. These are the questions I want you to consider for a moment. We'll get back to them. Take a moment to scan the slide, and then I want to speak to it. If there's two important things you take out of tonight, this should be one of them. I had a long time ago, a person came to me from another community and said, I don't understand why so many Jewish people are so charitable. And I sat him down for an hour and took him through this in more detail. This is an absolutely crucial thing to understand because it cuts across all definitions of Jewishness. We Jews feel the biblical sense of tzedakah. We feel that there is a social obligation. The Bible puts it, Ki lo yechdal evyon mikerev haaretz. The Torah in Devarim says, there will always be poor people. No matter what you do to redistribute the wealth of this world, it will remain unequal. With advanced apologies, I suppose, to Karl Marx and his followers. So that means that you and I have to try to right the social justice apple cart. There's a very famous Mishnah that says, what should the poor give? The poorest of the poor should still give charity. How can that be? They should take some of what they received and put it aside anyway. We, over the thousands of years, over millennia, have come up with an entire culture of giving. And part of understanding who we are and what happened in our community is understanding there was a tremendous clash in our community. When we talk about acculturation, we often think about picking up the outside trappings of the society in which we live. The other parts of acculturation are picking up the thought patterns of those among whom we reside. And one of the most powerful thought patterns that challenged tzedakah was the idea of caritas. They were doing someone a favor. And in fact, in Victorian times, that went further. Consider that for a moment. You may remember Scrooge, who in Christmas Carol makes the sarcastic comment, the Malthusian comment that maybe the poor ought all die and disappear from the earth. The idea in Victorian England that came to Canada was the poor are poor because they haven't done enough to do better. And if we help them, well, it's caritas. We might do something for them, and again, we might not. And if we do it, it's with half a hand, because it's their fault. We have to ask a question, sort of parallel to what Rav Freeman Cole asked earlier. At what stage did we Jews begin to think that tzedakah didn't work? Or does tzedakah require reforming as we live in a new land? If you think that's an arcane question, it's a random question, I take you back to my slide of UJA. UJA's present incarnation is all about the question I just asked you and what was on the slide before this one. Take a look for a moment again, please. Now, one of the most fascinating parts of the late 19th, early 20th century is the idea of professionalization. We still see it today. Think of a toothpaste commercial. You might not want to buy the stuff until someone comes out there with a white coat and a chart in their hand. Tell me, why do they have a white coat and a chart in their hand? Because that way they look subconsciously to us as though they were an expert. They have been invested with the aura of expertise. Same idea here, except we are more cynical now. We just go to Google and check 500 other results, and we don't necessarily believe the so-called expert on TV. But if you go back to the age that we're now talking about, the expert is a person who is invested with great powers. Because what goes on is we have professionalization going across all swaths of society. Universities are expanding. They're coming up with reasons and degrees and criteria to tell people what makes you officially a dentist, a doctor, an accountant. And because there are more and more hoops to jump through, the people who qualify for those designations now become permitted. Indeed, they are told to speak to everyone else about how their field should look. So here we will see the rise of two new fields, sociology and social work, both of which will argue that tzedakah is a bad model. Tzedakah is giving with the heart. We have to give with the head. We have to think long and hard about who should receive what, how they should receive it, what immigrants should receive, and how they can be integrated into North American life. In other words, when the expert speaks, they're invested with an aura of expertise that makes people listen to them, and the message they're going to give is very important. Consider this. So the social worker sees the immigrant. And I'm painting a broad pastiche. I admit to you that I'm simplifying, but the brush strokes are useful in our context. If you want, at the end of our series, I'm going to give you a whole page reading list. If you want a broader stroke, you want more things more defined for you, I have readings for you. But suffice it to say that while Jews weren't considered the worst immigrants, they were still considered to be the sort of people who had a lot to do in terms of improving their Canadianness when they got here. And the social worker was the agent of this removal of their foreignness. And as I mentioned last week as well, the old community, the downtowners, also wanted to remove their foreignness. So not only are Canadians, whatever that word back then meant, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, because the Irish Catholics were not quite considered Canadian anyway in Toronto, for a while. Jews are being told by Canadian authorities and by a small minority and steadily decreasing minority of their own people, all these immigrants who are coming in are being told, you need to become more Canadian. And this leads to some fascinating things that we wouldn't tolerate for a moment nowadays. I think the picture speaks for itself. I won't say anything. Take a look at the next slide. The social worker, being an expert, you understand, would come to an immigrant house, and they would go through the immigrants' eating habits. You know, a few years ago we had a whole controversy at TDSB school in which a child of Philippine extraction ate using their cutlery in a different way. They pushed their food onto their fork with their finger, which apparently is fine, and they were taken to task, and that produced quite an explosion. Nowadays, that's how we think. People who bring their ethnic habits ought to be respected and understood by people in Canada. Back then, even among the Jewish community, many people were saying, what are you eating? Chewing? You need to eat more Canadian food. In Chicago and in Toronto, there are all kinds of stories, all kinds of articles, all kinds of stuff in the press about the social worker coming and telling parents, here's how Americans or Canadians eat. And the invasiveness of this made immigrants feel terrified. So the other day we looked at the ward, and these people are basically living hand to mouth. Now they feel everyone's turning on them. They have come here to a strange land to escape persecution. They've often left relatives across the water. They've often struggling to survive. Very few speak English. And now they're being set upon by their own people and by people they don't even know who are telling them to do other things when they can barely survive in a new land. So there's a backlash, a very interesting backlash in the immigrant community. To understand that backlash, look at something you learned in Hebrew school. These are the famous ladder of tzedakah of the Rambam, of Maimonides, the great philosopher of medieval Spain and later Egypt. Everyone who came from the Russian Empire came from a system in which the Jewish community took care of its own, without exception. That has been true throughout Jewish history. Sometimes the system worked better, sometimes it worked worse, but Jews built orphanages for themselves. They took care of their sick and their destitute. They didn't worry about what the authorities might do because the authorities were not Jewish and you didn't trust the authorities. And if you were well treated by the authorities one year, you knew that the next year it might not work. So Jews became self-contained. Go back to Raymond and Breton. That's why Jews were successful in maintaining their continuity, because they developed so many social service and religious organizations to bond their community together, all of which followed that ladder, usually at the highest levels. You wanted to help people either find work that would make them independent, or at least do what we call in Hebrew, matan beseter, give in a manner so that the person doesn't know who's giving to them and not embarrassing them. So the old community seems very frightening to these newcomers because the Jewish communities, the settled community, the uptowners as we called them last week, have already begun to acculturate. And they've begun to talk in terms of scientific charity. And the talk of scientific charity is not on that ladder of tzedakah. But let me make it more clear from another angle. On the other hand, if you were a member of the downtown Jewish community, you felt like you were always putting your hand in your pocket, and many uptowners as well. Every day there's another person asking for money at your door. And quite frankly, even though Jewish law said, "Patoach tiftach yadcha," you shall surely open your hand le'achicha ha'avyon, to your destitute fellow Jew. That was very nice for the Torah to write, but when every morning you open your door to a new person asking for money, or a new campaign came to your mailbox, you started to feel hit upon. And if you're a member of the uptown community, you start to ask, aren't some of these institutions duplicating themselves? If I ran my business like this, would it work? This is a very important slide. Take a moment. I'm going to go forward one and then go back. I don't want you to memorize. I'm not giving you a true and false quiz. I want you to notice a trend. What we see here is the beginning of what Breton talks about taking place in North America, in Toronto. Last week we talked about how Holy Blossom became, and I say so again, the first example in a way of cineplex, where they provided a shochet, a ritual slaughterer. They provided a malamet, someone to teach the kids. Here we see the new community. The downtowners are saying, we already don't like the language of the uptown Jews. The uptown Jews talk a different language than we do. They're more acculturated than we are. So we need to go back to our roots, back to the ladder of tzedakah, and we need to take a shtick of Europe, a piece of Europe, and transplant it into Toronto. That's why we have shuls to this day, like mine, the Stashover, the Narayever, because some of these manifestations of European transplantation are still around. When you're faced with something new, you often retreat to the old and familiar. So here we see a very interesting effort to reach out to immigrants, but it's not all that European either. There's a tremendous effort at education here, teaching mothers how to be better mothers, having a dispensary for drugs, having a Hebrew free loan, having a place where people can shoot a game of pool. By the way, delinquency was a big problem in the downtown community. A lot of kids were untended most of the day, and we're going to talk about how the community tried to deal with that. Because the last thing you wanted was Jewish kids sitting in the police court. Back then that was called a große Schande, a very big shame. When a Jewish child was picked up on delinquency charges, we felt that somehow that brought shame upon all of the community. So what you see here are efforts to find a way to bridge their way into a new society. But consider the following. Notice the quote that Stephen Speisman, Allah Shalom, my teacher, picked out. This is why you see the downtowners, the new immigrants, founding their own institutions. And remember, they're now becoming the dominant force. There's a huge amount of immigration between 1901 and 1911 and right up to the war. And that will resume again at a lesser scale in the 20s. The downtowners are now the vast majority of Toronto Jews. And they don't like the idea of scientific charity. So this was going to play out like a TV show. You know what the ending was going to be. Once upon a time, there were a few people who came from Germany, England, and America. They started Holy Blossom. They became uptown Jews. They were all accepted. In 1882, there were the May Laws. Eventually, many, many Jews from the Russian Empire came. They swamped the uptowners in a crowd of their own. They built their own institutions, and all was happy ever after. History, my dears, ain't predictable, which is why I like studying it. I don't intend to become what I teach. So that's what makes the story interesting. Because the joker in this story, the unexpected part of the story, is about to come up right now. And that's what I find fascinating. Now, this is a really, really important idea to understand. There are a number of attempts to impose unity on charitable giving. Look at the chart again and notice the hierarchy here. There actually is an order to what goes on. Take another minute now and look at if there's a pattern that you see, because I want to talk to what you see and not about what's written down. I promised you I would talk about casualties on the way. Who's left out? All the guys and ladies on Spadina don't count anymore. They're not there. That's the first problem. And you're looking at a good 15% of Toronto Jews, maybe 20, who are not in this system. The Zionists are a very interesting case. In fact, they're the last piece of the puzzle. But Rabbi Freeman Cole asked a question whose beginnings actually start here. Think for a moment about Spadina. Spadina was the home of the garment industry. And as I mentioned last week, between 1901 and 1941, that industry basically became a Jewish industry. It also became an industry racked with strikes and union fights between various factions claiming that they knew the right way to organize the workers. But I'm not here to talk about the difference between the various unions. All of them agreed that being a union member carried a very important message of social justice. Their idea was to improve the world through social justice, pay equity, fairer hours, less hours, for all workers, not just Jewish workers. And part of the answer to Rabbi Freeman Cole's question is that the union movement, especially after the war, will begin to focus, once the victory over unionization is won, with the Rand formula in 1946, the unions will then turn their attention to fair employment practices and to getting rid of legalized discrimination in housing. So as the unions fix up their own agenda, which is to improve the quality of the workplace, when that largely happens because the war helps the process along, they then begin to turn to a wider vista of human rights. And part of the Jew becoming white is going to be the beginning of that story, which I'll talk about more next week, which is the whole movement forward out of what Porter called the vertical mosaic. At what point does a Jew no longer become marginal? At what point does a Jew become part of those who are privileged? And to what extent did the union's wonderful work and Congress's work with them after they mended fences in terms of fair employment standards have an important impact there? But for our purposes back in the 1930s and 40s, in terms of getting the community together as fundraising, this is a serious breach. You have a large and significant number of Jews who are not buying in. The Zionists are the most fascinating story. The Zionists were led by a very great man named Archie Fryman, who had a huge business up in Ottawa. Archie, may rest in peace, was a very powerful leader who believed that Zionism was so important that it was like a holy substance. It couldn't be adulterated. In other words, as Archie put it, if I was to mix the Palestine appeal with a charitable appeal, I'm mixing something of universal appeal to all Jews to something that's particularistic. Archie Fryman had such power in the Zionist Organization of Canada for 20 years that he single-handedly would not allow the Zionist campaign to become part of any of these campaign efforts. It was only after his tragic death, he literally died right in front of the whole congregation in shul, a death one must envy. But only after his death were negotiations slowly to open. It took another good 3.5 years for the final piece of what we now see as UJA, where we allocate funds domestically and to Israel. So we see that even in this period that we're covering today, only in 1948 was the state of Israel actually happening. Until then, even if we say, yes, there is more unity in fundraising, compared to what we have now, it's half a loaf. Because the agenda of raising money for Israel was done by a separate campaign. For your reading pleasure. This is the language of the new scientific charity. And the new scientific charity says, you know what? We can actually accomplish the goals of tzedakah. And we can do them more efficiently. And we can get more of the community to dig into their pockets if you listen to us. To which most of the older community did not want to do until they were forced to. And that's the rest of the story I want to tell you tonight. Where we have a younger university-educated cohort of Jewish professionals starting to emerge right after World War I. When I studied the professionalization and centralization of the community, I can tell you that without exception, everyone behind that was a university graduate at a time when very few Canadians were, and even very few Jews were. All of them were business people and they were university graduates who believed something. What did they believe? In what way did their university education inoculate them with a different idea? What's happened, and you can see this in their writing, is that at university, this young generation, the first in their families to go to university, often at great expense and self-sacrificed. That's where you hear all the stories of people locking themselves in bathrooms and furnace rooms to study. What did these people do? They did something really, really fascinating. They said, we've actually learned in university that we Jews are actually very similar to many Arab people. We have the same problems maintaining community. And that science has good ideas. And there's nothing wrong with taking ideas that work out there in the non-Jewish world and putting them to work in the Jewish world. Not everything out there is bad. Many things are good. And we want to put them to work for a very noble and important cause. Nice to say, hard to do. Watch why. For those of you who like labels or don't, what I've just called this is progressivism. I spoke to you a while ago and said the belief in the expert. This is progressivism. And this is one of the most potent forces in North America for 2 generations, between the 1880s and the end of World War II. So when these men speak, and they're also the donors, they're listened to. What happens now is fascinating. That, my friends, is a building on Annette Street. That is, believe it or not, the Jewish Children's Home of Toronto. I'm going to tell you a story that will help you understand everything about the clash of values and generations you will ever need to know, because that's how I learned it. This lovely building on Annette Street actually was a second home of the orphanage. Now, when I say orphanage, you think, these children have no parents. I have to tell you that wasn't generally true. Life in the ward was very hard. Many of these children had at least one parent. Nowadays, we have daycare. If you were a working parent, what would you do? Especially if, God forbid, you were a single working parent. You sent the kid to the orphanage. And they took care of it. And sometimes you went there and visited your child. And, believe it or not, on weekends, you might even take the child home. Now, it's interesting, because in Judaism, a yatom, an orphan, is someone who's missing a parent, period. So when the Jews talked about an orphanage, they meant an orphanage, someone who's missing a parent, and they are disadvantaged because of that, and they're providing a service. This place was marvelous. It had the cheapest cost of any orphanage in Ontario. Why? It had the most marvelous volunteers. It had a group of women, and I could stand here for 2 hours and talk about the role of women in charity in Jewish Toronto and in Judaism, but let's keep things straight and just, here's an example of it, of a much larger typology. These women literally adopted an orphan. Each of them came the same day of the week, and they interacted with that orphan. And things were wonderful, because volunteers don't need to be paid. There was a nurse. She was there 3 days a week. There was ready access to a doctor. There was a social worker. The child welfare authorities did supervise the orphanage. And the orphanage was under control of the Federation of Jewish Philanthropies, the second iteration of communal control. The Federation was composed of all of these young professionals. And they decided they didn't like the orphanage for 2 reasons. Reason 1, volunteers are not professionals. I'll say that again because it jars. Volunteers are not professionals. That is, they didn't care how many hours these women were putting in. because the social work journal said that orphans had to be spoken to in a certain manner, and volunteers wouldn't know what to do. The other part was that there was a larger trend in Britain, the United States, and Canada to foster homes, which were even cheaper than orphanages. To make a long story short, the Federation of Jewish Philanthropies took over the home, fired all the volunteers, and closed it down and farmed out the kids to foster homes. I once went to an interview where I started my research to a very lovely lady, it must have been about 34 years ago, and I went up to her apartment, the penthouse, one of the buildings on Walmer Road. And I talked with her for a long time about the orphanage, and after a while she looked at me and pointed to my tape recorder. Please remember that was in the pre-iPhone days. Said to me, "Can you turn the damn thing off, please?" I said, "Fine. I've learned already that that was when you got your best stories." She said to me, "You know, you see that, thank God, I've done very well in my life, and I don't lack for money. And you see this picture here, that picture right there on the wall, that's not my child. That's my foster child from the Jewish Children's Home. Do you know, young man, where that was?" Luckily for me, I didn't. I told her. She said, "They took away my orphan." And she started to cry. This was 50 years later. She started to cry. She said, "They took away my orphan. And to this day, I have never given a penny to UJA." Now this is one voice, but the viscerality of how she talked teaches us something important. Because in history, we always hear the voices of the winners. Who was left beside the road? That's what I wrote in my blurb. Who's left by the side of the road? An awful lot of volunteers are left by the side of the road when professionalization takes place. A lot of the, shall we say, the guts of tzedakah is taken away by the introduction of scientific charity. Is that good? Is that bad? Is it necessary? Probably. Did it have to be done that way? Probably not. There's a deep divide in the community between those who know, pardon my way of saying no, and those who know through experience. And people like this lovely lady I met felt like not only had they been nullified, but their whole experience as volunteers didn't count anymore. That will take us to the next slide. Progressivism said, if you're not an expert, you don't know. You may have taken care of those children. You may have helped in the hospital ward. You don't know. What we're going to see now, many of you volunteer, is that communities have made peace with volunteerism after they train their volunteers. We've actually come full circle in volunteerism. You go down to Mount Sinai, they have a wonderful event honoring their volunteers, and they train their volunteers. But at this time, it was a war. And it was the professional versus the volunteer. Now both sides have realized the value of volunteerism. But the professionals will still tell you, well, of course we understand. Because now the people who we choose as volunteers, we choose them because they have skills that they brought with them from their professional lives. So they will still argue with you, there's no excuse for professionalism. So that's the story on that one. Which brings us one step further. In 1954, a guy by the name of Vincent Grossman came to Toronto. He was a Czech guy. He'd been raised in an orphanage. And he said, I want to build an orphanage here. And UJA actually sent him, United Jewish Appeal, you may not build an orphanage. Our community goes to a foster home. And they ended up in a lawsuit that was dismissed for $100,000, which he claimed he had taken away from him because no land campaign. So this war over orphanages did not die so quickly. Even after the war, there were echoes of it. It wasn't an easy thing to deal with. Which building is that, people? Who recognizes it? Clue number one, Associated Hebrew Schools. Brunswick Avenue, Talmud Torah. Now, there's actually two parts to the Brunswick Avenue Talmud Torah. Part one is the Talmud Torah. Part two is the why. Now, this is a great story for a lot of reasons. Let me explore them very quickly. This is the first attempt in Toronto to make what was called a Jewish center. Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, later the founder of Reconstructionism, had this great idea, again a sort of iteration of Cineplex. The more Jews can do in a synagogue, the better it is. We have a gym now, a real gym thanks to the Kimmel family, in Beth Tzedec. We have a dining hall. We have a catering facility. All the idea goes back to build a Jewish center. That's what you do. In the mid-20s, this beautiful building was built by the Associated Hebrew Schools, then called the Toronto Hebrew Free School. It wasn't free, by the way. It was free because it was free of ideology. It was, and it still is today, to their great credit, its only ideology was a linguistic one. It was Ivrit Ivrit. They taught immersion style. And they taught text, and they had a very successful way of teaching. And they appealed across the community. Their appeal was community-wide, keep that in mind. This building was built at great expense with a huge mortgage. Along came the Depression. And this was one of those mortgages that was principal or interest. For a while, all they did was pay the interest, and the principal kept accumulating. After a while, by 34, they began to run out of money. By 37, they ran all out of money, stopped paying the teachers, and the banks started making noises about taking over the building. This is perhaps the seminal story of Toronto Jewish fundraising. Because this school had such a wide appeal to everyone, the entire community got upset. Most upset, though, were a small group of businessmen. Not all sent their kids there, all of whom had gone to university. And they looked at this and they said, very brilliantly, there are two problems here. One is a cash flow problem that we can fundraise for, and it'll just be like putting our fingers in the dike. We raise money, it solves the problem, but we don't change the way the place operates in a few more years. Here we go again. That's how we've always run fundraising. And they said, we're sick of it. There's another problem here. There's a capital problem. None of these buildings are capitalized properly. They're all in debt up to their eyeballs. And if they don't do something about that now and properly reduce the mortgages on these buildings, all of this will come back to haunt us. To make a long story short, these men held a campaign where they separately raised money for the operating budget and stabilized it, and they separately raised money to pay down the mortgage. Many of these men then said, wait a minute, this isn't just going on here. Many of us are members in other organizations. What impresses me is how many people have multiple affiliations. And they said, we see these problems everywhere. Let's get together as a group. It worked here in Associated. Let's solve this problem at many other places. That's what they knew. This is entirely the big givers. The first meeting of the UJWF, the United Jewish Welfare Fund, was a success from the beginning. The top 100 givers in the city had already pledged 80% of the campaign before they even met. Welcome to UJA 2013. The only question is, what does this mean for us now? Because what the UJWF did was add the final wrinkle, which was, if you don't do your accounting as an organization and you come to us for money, you're not going to get anything. Mount Sinai Hospital, of all places, found that out in a hurry. In 1939, they came and said, hi, we're Mount Sinai, we're in a Jewish hospital, we like money. To which the UJWF said, that's nice, and where are your books? We don't need to show them to you, said Mount Sinai, because we've been around for a long time, and you guys are upstarts. Not a problem, said the UJWF. You're not on the campaign. After Mount Sinai realized that cost them $36,000 back then, all of a sudden their books were open and they were in the campaign. This was the power of the UJWF. And everyone begins to affiliate with them because you don't have a choice. But the positive part is, think of what it's like when everyone's sitting around that table. Remember the first slide I showed you, the pie chart. Who gets what? The best way to build Jewish continuity is to sit around a table with a bunch of people whose organizations you aren't a member of and have to think about their value while they aren't a member of your organization and they think about the value of your organization. And you all end up learning about all the Jewish community together, and you learn how to value each other for the separate commitments and what you all do for the community. And that became the power of this. Everyone who got into this, who managed it, realized that we were a larger community than just the organizations that they were affiliated with. But before you get too happy with all this, the average Jew on Spadina, Handimnish, couldn't care less. The average Jew on Spadina says, all right, I don't know some of these guys. I'm a member of a union. I don't like them. I still contribute to my union. The shuls, by the way, aren't in this at all. More on that later. And who else isn't on this? The Zionists still aren't in for the reason I gave you. So don't think everyone's happy or everyone cares. But the big givers care, and that's what drives it forward. Is that good or bad? Think about it. For those of you who are visual, I really want you to notice who's out. Very important to keep that in mind. I always like to get back to Breton. This is why our community succeeds. Because look at all the different organizations that can now be financed. A hospital, a free loan society, later on a kosher meat supervising group, which originally was under Congress. All these various parts of ethnic survival are all paid for by the community. We find it easy to be Jews today because we created a system that helped us. That's Jewish institutional continuity. And that's the importance of what we've done. And last of all, it created a Jewish civil service. Then you can be cynical and say, that's nice, it created jobs for nice Jewish boys and girls. But it's also important because it was hard to get jobs then for some Jews who were very well trained, but there was a huge amount of discrimination in universities and in public service still. Many people who could not get jobs in government but were trained for it often got jobs in Jewish organizations managing them, and they became known as the Jewish civil service. And there was no shame in being a communal helper. It offered an outlet for trained people. Well, I'm pretty well right on time without looking at my watch this first time. I'm going to go back to Rabbi Freeman Cole's question in a different way. The year I got married, in the Canadian Jewish News, there was an ad. It said, "Come to Spring Farm." Spring Farm was a community being built at? Right, built by Tenenbaum. And he basically wrote there, we are making a community in which, yes, you can be Shomer Shabbat. There will be a synagogue, debate Avraham Yaakov. There will be a kosher plaza, which there still is now. All the amenities of being Jewish are up there. Come up there, make a journey up Bathurst Street with us. Go further north on Bathurst. And I ask you an interesting question, to which I don't yet know the answer, but I want you to think about. There's two ways of looking at this. One is, Canada is a land of hyphenated identity. We're all proud to be hyphenated Canadians. If we look at it that way, then we see a healthy, successful immigrant group, like the Ukrainians, like the Chinese, who have done very well in Canada by being cognizant of their ethnicity and hyphenating it to their Canadianness. And speaking as a social scientist, I'd say that's just great. On the other hand, I could look at that and say in a cynical way, are we building ourselves another ghetto? Are we so happy to build ourselves in our ghetto? If Canada's so comfortable, we have to live only with each other? Does the city have to be a series of different ethnic enclaves? Read Michael Ondaatje's first article when he first came to Toronto, when he writes about going to York University. He talks about, I sat down in a cafe and said, the Muslims are staying there, the Jews are staying there. I don't know, Canada's a strange country, everyone sits with each other, but not apart from each other. There's no easy answer to that one. But yet there's something very important. It's a long way from Forest Hill to Bathurst and Steeles and Bathurst and Seven and further. The UJA now had a tremendous role in future planning because all these buildings cost money. Baycrest was originally supposed to be where the PJCC is now in the valley, but they ended up swapping land. A lot of stuff went on in terms of schools for about 4 or 5 years between 1946 and 51, when money was scarce. The UJWF, the United Jewish Welfare Fund, actually told certain schools, you may not conduct a campaign yet, even though you're bursting at the seams, because there's no money out there. There's a lot of future planning and a lot of expertise done in the community, still now, demographic studies. We need this. But where are we going now with our barometer? So to answer Rabbi Freeman Cole's question, in part, we're going to talk about that in great detail next week. Moving north from here into the suburbs, now with a fully armed community organization, the envy of everyone in North America. At what point did we become part of the mainstream? How did we become part of the mainstream? And what does that say about us? Is our success due to the fact that we are not of color? Or is our success due to other things that everyone can duplicate? Also, when we go on our walk together in May, when we go down to what we call an area of first settlement, we're going to look and say, how do immigrant groups move? The next time, last point, here at Bathurst and Wilson, look around at the new Philippine businesses, because their businesses are exactly like the ones Jews had on Dundas and College in the 30s. Most of the Philippine community that earns money are outside the Philippines. They send back approximately $17 billion a year to the Philippines. Now, if you go and look at their businesses, what do we see there? Immigrant aid places and places to send money. Go down Spadina and Dundas in the 30s, and that's what you saw too. So, on the one hand, we built community through our organizations. We did that through improving them. When an organized cohort of intellectuals imposed change in scientific tzedakah upon everyone else. Was it always nice? As I told you, no. Was it necessary? It was, because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to survive as a community. But where are we going now, and how do we get to be where we are? That's a story for next week, so thank you very much.